All right. So good morning. So we are going to continue our talks in talking about populations and various components thereof. For today, the two chapters I want to cover are 11 and 12. One is on population growth, the other is on life histories. I feel that this information works really well together. So I am going to teach these two chapters together, and you'll kind of see how as I go through how this information works really well together. All right, so as I said, I want to look at these two chapters together. And so the first chapter, chapter 11, focuses on population growth. But when we are talking about life histories, basically we're talking about growth of populations. And so I'll go over the various types of population growth and kind of follow that chapter, but then we'll come back to the life history stuff and then come back at looking at these various types of growth and how they affect various life strategies. So like I said, we'll kind of bring these two things together. That being said, we'll also bring back some information that we talked about last week. So the first two types of growth curves look very similar. However, the big difference is this one with geometric growth, we are looking at a single generation per year. But if you look at this growth curve, you have about 6 years and then the curve kind of shoots up, right? And so it kind of almost looks a little bit exponential, but it's not super duper rapid. So this one is geometric growth. The next one is exponential growth, and the curve looks relatively similar. However, with this one, we are talking about overlapping generations. So with exponential curves, obviously they're exponentially modeled. You have continuous growth because you have overlapping generations. So think of something like bacteria, right? They are continuously dividing, right? And so you would see exponential growth that way. Where with something like plants or a lot of organisms, right? They have to wait till they're of developmental age, and then you start to see reproduction occur, right? So again, the main difference, geometric growth, you have one single generation per year. In exponential growth, overlapping generations. Okay, so here we have logistic population growth. The first thing I want to start off talking about is carrying capacity. Have you guys heard of the term carrying capacity before? I see some nods. Okay. So carrying capacity is defined by the letter K. And basically what carrying capacity is the number of individuals a particular area can support. And now it could be space, it could be nutrients or food or available resources, water, right? Could be any sort of limiting factor that once you have a population that exceeds that, what is going to happen to that population? If you have a population that can no longer be supported, what do you think is going to happen?
Extinction or death.
Right. Hopefully not extinction. If it's sustained for a long period of time, yes, extinction, but death, right?
Death.
You're going to have a population that's in decline for some period of time until those resources come back. Now, if the resources don't come back, then we could definitely be talking about extinction. But okay, so let me show you what this curve looks like. Okay, so this is a logistic population growth curve. So I had on the previous slide, it looks like an S, right? So if you look sideways, you can see it kind of has that S type shape. So if you have new individuals in a new area, right, if they're all of a sudden a starting population in a new area, you're going to have unlimited resources. And in times when there are a lot of resources available, you are going to have rapid growth, right? And so we see this accelerated growth when there are a lot of resources available. What happens when we hit carrying capacity? Do you think
Competition.
We have limitations.
we're going to have limitations? Now, we're a population of individuals, right? Do you think we're actually going to be like, whoa, 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 hey, hang on, everybody, we're about to hit K? Do you think this is what actually happens? We're like, we get up to the line and we're like, okay, as a population, we got to stop reproducing because there's no more resources.
This is why we have starving people.
Right? No, that's not what happens, right? The curve doesn't go like this. What do you think the curve actually does? No, not yet, Fanny. What happens first? This population's growing, growing, growing. Do you think it just all of a sudden hits K and just plateaus?
It's gonna start going down, won't it?
That population
Goes down.
Unlimited resources. We're happy. We're reproducing, right? We're going to keep reproducing. We're going to exceed this line. And then Fanny, then we're going to crash, right? So what probably is more realistic is this population goes up, passes K, then we really don't have resources and it crashes. And so it probably more cycles around K. Please do not think that all of a sudden a population gets to this K line and just kind of, settles itself out. There's going to be more like this is actually what's going to happen. So, like I said, we have accelerated growth rate right in this area. So at this particular time, your birth rate is exceeding your death rate, right? We have a lot increased growth at this particular point on the graph, right? Do you guys remember the 4 factors that affect population size? I'll give you a hint. 2 of them are right here. So you have a population, you have birth rates, you have death rates. What are the other 2 factors that influence population size?
Is it immigration and emigration?
Yes, it's immigration and emigration. So people coming in and people leaving, right? So those are basically the 4 factors. So like I said, at this particular point in time, we have unlimited resources. So maybe you have people coming in and birth rates would be exceeding your death rates. What happens when we get over to this point on the curve?
The birth rate and death rate are equal to each other.
Right, they're about equal, right? Because like I said, it's not going to be a flat line. You're going to have periods where resources are available, so it's going to go up, and then we're going to decline, right? So equal over time would be more like that. So this is probably more realistic as a logistic growth curve, right? We see increased rapid growth, and then K is probably somewhere around in here. But like I said, you're going to come up, things are going to be depleted, those resources, or space, right? Could be space as well. And then you're going to have things kind of go down and then kind of come up, and you're going to see this kind of inflection, right, over a period of time. Okay, so we talked about a population coming up to that K, right, that carrying capacity. So when our populations get to a large size, things begin to happen as we have what are called density dependent factors And so again, as our populations grow, we're going to start having competition because resources are limited, right? It could be resources, like I said, could be water, could be food, could be access to mates, right? Could be water. If we are a tree, could be sunlight, right? So again, we kind of talked about how an organism interacts with the environment. And so all of those things that we talked about, so par with sunlight, nutrients in the soil, access to water, temperature, all of those things are going to increase competition as the density or population size increases. What about disease? Why would disease be density dependent?
Is it because if there's more organisms, they're more closer to each other, and then they spread it more?
Exactly.
They had more hosts.
Closer proximity, the ease or transmission is going to be easier because those individuals, the hosts, are more closely related. All right, absolutely. And so this is why we're all right now telling everyone to social distance, is it keeps the host, i.e. us, separated and hopefully can help reduce transmission. So density independent factors, right? So things that affect a population that has nothing to do with population size, right? And these are going to be more natural disasters, i.e. weather, could be a volcano, could be a basalt flow, right? Could be flooding or mudslides or things like that, fires, right? You could have a fire come across a city of 20, or you could have a fire come across a city of 2,000, right? Size of that population isn't going to matter as a fire is going through, right? So density dependent and density independent are all factors that are going to affect populations, right? So I'm not going to test you on this specific thing, so you don't have to write down all these numbers. But what I want to show you here is, if just as an example, right? So finches, right? So there was a drought in 1997. And so they went in after the drought and they looked at how the finch population plummeted, right? And so what they looked to is then how the plants themselves failed to produce seeds that would feed the finches. So again, a density population was affected by ultimately weather, right? So would that be density dependent or density independent?
Density independent.
Right, that would be density independent, because whether we had 20,000 finches or 1,200 finches, right, the drought came in, wiped out the seeds, which ultimately affected the finch population, right? So that would be density independent. And so given enough time, you could see how there was a drought. So this is the number of finches here with this green line. Here you have rainfall. And you can see there was a drought, right? Very limited rainfall for an extended period of time. And you can see how that finch population just plummeted, kind of plateaued, right? Because there was probably some seed available, right? Enough to support a limited number of finches. But look what happened as soon as the rainfall came back, right? There was water availability. What happens when a tree drops seeds and say environmental conditions are not optimal? What happens to that seed?
It dies.
Does the seed die?
Oh, well, I guess, I mean, it can fall in, but like it won't sprout anything if there's no rain.
Germinate, right? But, if we wait 10 years and all of a sudden it's rainfall, what's going to happen to that seed that was just sitting there? right? It's going to germinate, right? And then be able to produce more seed and be able to sustain those elevated rates of the finch population. So, okay, so now that was kind of chapter 11 material, right? And so this is chapter 12 material, and you'll see how this kind of comes back to the information we had just covered. Oh, let me go back to this slide. FYI, this is a picture that I took, I think it's like 6-7 years ago. So mid-October in Waco, even in Lubbock, is monarch migration season. So as you guys are kind of driving about, you may start to notice increased butterfly movement, and that's the monarchs actually starting to come through. And so mid-October, a couple of years ago, I was driving, and I noticed an enormous amount of butterflies in flight. And so, do you guys know where the Walmart is in Hewitt? Yeah. So right outside they have a tire shop, and right along that parking lot they have these bushes, and the monarchs, there were thousands of them in in the tire and lube center of the Walmart. And so I stopped over and had a tire changed. No, I'm kidding, I didn't. But I sat there and in the parking lot, and I just sat there with my net, and I tagged like 100 monarchs, and they were just absolutely everywhere. So talking about life histories, 'tis the season for monarch migration through Texas. All right, so we kind of chatted a little bit about this here and there. So when we were talking about life histories, right, of a particular species, so we kind of looked at it from the population level. And so here, just kind of looking at it more from the species level, there are lots of things to consider when we were talking about population size and how organisms grow and develop. And so we talked a little bit about this already when we were looking at our survivorship curves, right? Can you guys tell me the difference between a type 1 and type 3 survivorship?
Isn't type 1 the one where like a bunch of offspring die early, but then as they get older, they have a higher survivability rate? And then type 3, they do pretty fine until they get older? Or is type 3 when they...
Backwards.
Oh, okay,
But,
okay.
but yes, you know, those are the two strategies, right, with that. So with type 1, you know, basically once you make it past the first year or so, you know, survivorship's pretty high until you start, you know, at least the graph we were looking at with the sheep was about till year 12. And then, you know, as older age, things start to drive off. And then with type 3, which was the example with sea turtles, right? You had rapid deceleration. And then if you made it past that first year, again, pretty much survivorship was pretty steady throughout, but a lot of loss of individuals initially. So kind of coming back to those ideas. So we can think of a organism, think of lots of different factors. Length of life, right, is going to be important. Now, if you're an organism that has a very short length of life, what do you think your sole purpose during that short lifespan is all about?
Reproducing.
Reproducing. So for example, because I'm an insect person, mayflies is a really great example. Some mayflies may live for 2 hours, 5 days. And if you are only alive for 2 hours or 5 days, you're all about reproduction, so much so that as adults, mayflies don't even have mouth parts. Why do you need to grow mouth parts if all you're doing is reproducing, right? So length of life is important. Age at reproduction, right? You know, you may have care for an individual until they're able to reproduce, right? And then they kind of move on that from there. Body size, right? Think of it this way when we're talking about reproduction, right? Think of adult babies, not going to happen, right? Think of it, elephants. What is the size of a elephant being born, right? Are you going to be able to carry 200 of those like an insect? Absolutely not, right? So body size is something to consider. Timing of reproduction, right? You know, what is the reproductive output for a human as far as timing of reproduction? You know, about 9-10 months, right? You can only have offspring every 9-10 months. So you're out of commission for a period of time. Number of offspring. Now, number of offspring is also going to go back to body size, right? Some things to consider there. So size of offspring, and then survivorship offspring, right? How much maternal care is given to the various types of species. So life history, there are lots of things to consider. So there's some trade-off, right? So generally there is a trade-off between size of the offspring and the numbers of offspring, right? Think of something like insects, right? They lay lots of different eggs. However, those eggs are very, very small because the insect's very small. So when we look at that, we can see there's lots of genetic diversity, right? If I have 100 offspring, I am putting my genes, 100 eggs, out into the environment, right? So high genetic diversity. However, if I have 100 offspring, what do you think the survivorship of those 100 is going to be? Am I going to be able to provide lots of maternal care to ensure, you know, they reach of age? And probably not. On the other side, usually for organisms that have larger offspring, they're not going to have many of them, right? They probably physically can't carry that many. So generally with organisms that have larger offspring, because they're having so few, their survivorship is going to be the advantage, right? Because there's generally maternal care associated with it, they usually are guaranteed to reach of age. However, because we are having few individuals, our input into the environment as far as our genes is relatively low, right? We're only having one offspring. We're contributing, but it's not like I'm contributing 100 offspring, right? Okay, so I kind of gave you some of the variable characteristics when we're talking about life histories. We can generally broadly put them into two types of categories, right? So we talked about few offspring, but they're larger, or you could have many offspring that are generally smaller. So we generally put them into two categories, kind of. We have what are called R-selected species, which is basically high population growth rates. And then you have K-selected species, which basically hover around carrying capacity, which is where you get that K from, right? And with K-selected species, they're better at using resources. They just don't, usually with their populations, they don't go through the roof, so to speak. They kind of hover around K. Now, they're at ends of a continuum. What I mean by that is, so Ashley put in houseflies in the chat, right? She talked about from fertilized egg to adult is 7 to 10 days. How would you characterize that? Is R or K? I should then ask the question, Ashley, is how many eggs does a fly leave? But in your mind, would you, when you think flies, would you think that they were more like R or K individuals?
K individual.
They'd be R because they're making a lot.
So that you would think that they could be more like R, right? Rapid increase as far as populations grow. If they are reproducing, basically going from egg to adult in 7 to 10 days, every 2 weeks you could be doubling your population, right? But think of it something like a elephant. How often do they reproduce? How many offspring do they have? Probably one offspring. Anyone know what
It takes a long time for them to reproduce in
Right, it
between.
takes a very
Isn't
long
gestation like a year?
Or 2.
Yeah, it's kind of like human-ish, not exactly, but close to that. So think of it this way: if you had a fly and you had an elephant, which one would be R and which one would be K? So remember, R, you're talking about high population growth rate. Would you consider an elephant to be a high population growth rate?
No, it'd be
The fly, right? So flies, insects, those are generally more R selected species. Elephants, humans, a lot of mammals would be more of your K selected species. However, here's where the continuum comes in. What about rabbit populations? Mice. How many offspring do they have?
6 or something?
Huns.
They're higher, right? You've probably heard the term reproduce like bunnies. Why do we say that?
They can get pregnant every day of the month except for 3.
So they reproduce a little bit more rapidly, right? So this is where we talk about the continuum, right? You have something like a mammal like an elephant, you have something like an insect, and then you have something like bunnies, which is probably more on the R side of things when you're thinking about mammals, right? So it's a continuum. I mean, the other thing too, there are some beetles that are like 6 to 9 inches in length. They're obviously going to take a little bit more time to grow and develop as opposed to something like a housefly. So even in the land of insects, right, there's some organisms that do take longer periods of time to develop. So there are some insect species that I consider more K versus R along the insect continuum, right? So kind of going back to our logistic growth curve, right? So our selected individuals, right? We're talking about accelerated population growth rate. This is where our selected populations would stay, right? Remember, this is where we have unlimited resources, and so populations are just growing, growing, growing. Now, Fanny kind of talked about earlier, with our selected individuals, you would have populations exceed because they just cannot stop reproducing. That is what they do: reproduce, 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 and then they would massively crash. Massive, right? Think of it as if you have a culture of bacteria, right? You are culturing in the lab. If that bacteria continually starts reproducing and depletes all of the resources, that population would die off, right? Now with K selected individuals, you still would have that increased population rate, but again, it's just going to kind of hover around K. They're a little bit better at utilizing those resources. Now, it's not always this smooth, but generally speaking, R selected species would be in this range, and K selected species would be more in this range. So this table is directly from your textbook, and I would pretty much promise you if you Googled R versus K, you could probably find some of these online. But there is a trade-off, right? And that's kind of what I want to show you here is if you're looking at, so growth rate, right, with our selected species. So our selected species would have this column of characteristics here, and K-selected species would have this column of characteristics here. So if we compare these, rate of population increase, you're going to see with R-selected species that rate of increase is high, versus the rate of increase in K-selected species is relatively low. And if it goes back to the number of offspring, right? If one elephant is having one offspring, population growth rate is going to be low, right? But if I'm a beetle and I'm having 15 offspring all at once, right, population growth rate is going to be accelerated. Now, competitive ability. If generally when organisms that our strategy isn't competition, it's just reproduction, right? A lot of times with these individuals, if you're just putting out organisms into the environment, they're not going to be necessarily very competitive, right? So competition is going to be better for K-selected individuals. So development, again, as they're trying to get to developmental age, right? An organism is going to go from juvenile phase to adult fairly rapidly with R-selected species. And if you think, when is a human of reproductive age? Kind of varies, but 11, 12, 13, right? So very slow, where, as Ashley was saying, a housefly goes from egg to adult in 7 to 10 days, right? That's pretty rapid. So body size, obviously we kind of talked about a trade-off there with reproduction. And so there's kind of a contrast. Now, again, there's a continuum, right? We could, you know, if we compared mice to elephants, obviously this would seem more like a R-selected species, and this would be more of a K-selected species. But if we were to compare mice to, you know, houseflies, you know, then you would see differences that way. So what you're comparing is going to be important. But all of that being said, it is definitely a continuum. We can see lots of examples of, you know, R versus K, even within mammals. So we talked about survivorship curves last week, right? So you have type 1, if you remember, where we basically don't lose a lot of individuals until they're a lot older, right? Where type 3, we lose a lot of individuals initially, but then once they make it past a certain age, then they can kind of, you know, hang around for a period of time. And so we can compare, where do R and K fit in on these survivorship curves. And type 1 would be K, right? So those larger individuals, right? And then R selected species would be more the type 3. So with R selected species, small number of the offspring size is small, but a lot of them, right? So sea turtles, right, was the example we talked about for type 3. Lots of eggs, not much maternal care, right? Those would be, but what's the size of the adult? Relatively large, right? And so do you guys see how kind of the R selected and the K selected work back to these survivorship curves? Do you see how the information correlates? I see some nodding. So, okay, fantastic. All right, so just as a kind of refresher, like I said, I put these little, if you look in your textbook, I went ahead and put these little kind of circles in here for you to look at. But like I said, your K selected, that K comes from carrying capacity. And so if you tie these concepts together, it'll help kind of refresh and help remind you which concepts. So type 1, we have lots of individuals that are able to get to reproduction age, where type 3, right, a massive drop off initially because we have lots of individuals being reproduced, right? And so kind of think of these different concepts together. It'll kind of help refresh your memory where everything kind of fits on these various graphs. So plants are slightly different. There are some other things to consider when it comes to plant reproductive strategies. So when it comes to plants, we have basically 3 different categories based on life strategies. So we have what are called ruderals, we have stress tolerant plants, and we have more competitive type plants. So when you think of a plant that grows rapidly, what would you think in your head?
Aloe?
So aloe goes pretty quick.
Um,
What else? Look at your front yard. What would
Weeds.
weeds, right? Weeds, you cannot keep up with them. Right? They just are continuously putting out seeds and they grow fairly rapidly. However, as your grass starts to come in, it will then outcompete those weeds, right? So we can basically put them on a little triangle like this, right? So we could look at intensity of competition, we can look at disturbance, and then stress, right? So those are the 3 factors to consider when we're talking about plants and how they reproduce. So I think this, do me a favor, if you're writing this is incorrect right here. So if we look at this chart, so stress tolerant, right? You can see they can deal with a high amount of stress, but they do not like competition, right? So it shouldn't be disturbance, it should be competition. With competitive plants, right, you can see high competition and low disturbance.
The stress tolerant plants have the no disturbance portion to that. Is that correct though? Even though it's written, it was supposed to say competition.
Yes. So if you look at this triangle graph, you'll exactly see why this is incorrect here. So stress tolerant, right? You can see stress is high and competition is low. So it shouldn't say no disturbance. It should say low competition. Because if you look at competition, competitive plants, right? So competitive would be up here. And you can see they like high competition, but low disturbance. So intensity of disturbance, think of it this way. If you go out and you dig out an area, right, you're going to plant your tree, you start digging things up, you go out the next day and you see those weeds start to come in immediately, right? And so that's kind of the idea of disturbance, right? So, like I said, plants are a little bit different. There are some different factors to consider that when we're talking about organisms is a little different. So this graph is in your textbook. And so it's probably the easiest way that we can look at plant strategies. But those are the 2 chapters. So that is 11 and 12. And so we talked about population growth and then life histories. you should be able to go back, especially the logistic population growth curve, and be able to talk about life histories and how and where they fit in on those population growth curves. So, do you guys have any questions as far as populations go? So we've kind of talked about it for a few days here. So on Wednesday, we will come back and talk about species interactions and competition.